Welcome everyone to the Score Fantasy Football Podcast presented by Subway. I'm your host, Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at The Score, and with me today is my friend and confidant, David P. Woods, a supervising editor at The Score, and a man who sadly is currently about to sell off his players in our main keeper league. The 2018 dream is dead, Woods. What happened?
I wish you'd stop bringing up my sad team on this podcast. I don't think anyone cares. I'm almost past the point of caring. Look, it's I'll tell this to anyone who plays fantasy football, like add some sort of trading draft picks for next year or keepers or something to keep owners interested in seasons that go off the rails, because mine has kind of gone off the rails here. But, I'm going to build and take a run for the title next year.
I will say this, and then we will leave it alone, Woods. You may remember that we've talked about Woods dropping James Conner a week before the season. You have to think that, and you don't even have to answer this, we'll just move on, but you have to think that if you had Conner all these weeks, might have got you an extra win or two. I don't know. I didn't think it was going to sewer your season, but
I mean, it's not like
it might have.
I haven't literally gone back and added his points every single week and seen if I would have won and what my record would be. I haven't done that or anything like that. Of course not. That would be insane.
Well, sad times. We'll pour some out for Team Woods. All right. On today's episode, I'm going to run through a couple of the updates that you're going to see in my rankings on Thursday, and then we're going to preview Week 6 with the podfather himself, Matt Kelley from RotoUnderworld, and we're going to get his thoughts on all the biggest fantasy questions heading into this week's game, including some of the players that are being overlooked, and then later, in the same vein of Woods giving up on his fantasy season, we're going to tell you some of the players that it is time to give up on right now. Either move them in a trade or just outright drop them at this point. And I think some of the names might surprise you. But first, my updated rankings will be available on The Score on Thursday. And let's take a first look at some of the notable risers and fallers that you're going to see in our Next Level Updates segment, which is presented by our friends at Subway, who upped the taste ante with their new Next Level Paninis. TJ Yeldon he's down a couple spots in my rankings, and one of the main reasons is that the Cowboys have been pretty solid against the run. They're allowing they haven't allowed anybody actually to go over 60 yards. Only one player has gone over 60 yards, and I don't expect Jamaal Charles to have a huge impact. We'll talk a little bit more about his role later. He is a veteran presence though, so until we really know how he's going to factor in there, I'm just bumping Yeldon down a few spots to RB13. Sterling Shepard gets a bump up to wide receiver 25. The Eagles' pass defense, it's just a way to attack them. You got to attack them through the air. I expect the Giants to have a pass-heavy approach in this one. And Philly's allowed 7 different receivers to go over 75 yards against them through 5 games. I think Beckham and Shepard are both going to get that done this week. And one change here, I'm dropping Dalvin Cook to RB20. He might even fall lower, and who knows if he's even going to play this week. Hopefully we're going to hear some positive news throughout the week, but with that hamstring injury, we've seen several players come back too early and re-aggravate those injuries. So I'm approaching Cook with caution this week, and until we're sure that he's going to suit up, you should probably have another player in mind to play this week just in case. But if you want to see the rest of my rankings, the full update and all these changes is going to be up on Thursday on The Score. Today's guest is one of the most animated members of the fantasy community. He's one of the most entertaining members of the fantasy community. It's Matt Kelley, the CEO, the big boss at RotoUnderworld. You can find him on Twitter at fantasy_mansion. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Gentlemen, sorry about your fantasy team, buddy.
Yeah, well,
condolences.
It's all right, yeah.
And it happens. I was in a dynasty startup. We have supporters of the RotoUnderworld radio show. We set up dynasty leagues, and I participate in many of them with the audience. And in my startup, I went Le'Veon Bell and then Leonard Fournette. So that team is already dead. Dead.
Ouch. Yeah, there's a lot of top picks already falling off.
DOA. Dead upon arrival. So I feel your pain, man. But my other leagues, though, I'm killing it.
Well, I actually have to thank you, Matt, because when I came on your podcast before the season, I got a couple bold predictions on that podcast. I nailed a couple of them, it looks like here. And I got helped out. I got helped out by some injuries.
On a top 5 tight end, and your truther status for rookie breakout Marquez Valdez-Scantling?
I have to admit, though, I did get helped out by injuries, so I can't take all the credit there, but
it doesn't matter how
it is looking
happened.
pretty good. And
I couldn't believe it.
The Ebron one, I had
producers that cut these shows up and they send me the clips, and I said, "Wait, when was this recorded? What? How? How did he do this?"
Well, the Ebron one I had written up in our bold predictions here.
I can't believe it, of fantasy football.
Well, the Valdez-Scantling one I had actually forgotten, so I was glad that you brought that one back up for me. It's nice to see. And, I mean, not all our bold predictions come true, but it looks pretty good in those ones.
Celebrate the hits, man. I don't worry about the takes that never come to fruition. It's like they never happen. They're lost in the sands of time. I just focus on the positive. The hits are the things I focus on. The hits just keep on coming. If you look at my timeline on Twitter, it's just hit after hit. Oh, but you were wrong.
Well, let's see if we can make some predictions for the coming performances in Week 6 here. Let's see if we can do well on that. And let's start with Jameis Winston. We got our first glimpse of him for 2018 right before his bye in Week 4. It wasn't great. It was a pretty bad game for that team as a whole. But Tampa had a chance to regroup over their bye week. Now Winston gets his first start this year, and it is the best possible matchup. I mean, against the Falcons defense, they're so banged up. Atlanta's allowed 3 passing touchdowns in 4 straight games here. And even with O.J. Howard likely out, I think he's probably going to miss another week or 2 here. Winston is just loaded with talent in his pass-catching core. Matt, is Jameis just an immediate QB1 for fantasy owners here?
Yes. We thought that Jameis Winston could threaten top 5 status before he was suspended. And that was before we fully appreciated this supporting cast. Mike Evans is playing the best football of his career right now. We thought there was potential, we talked about this on my show, that Chris Godwin could eventually surpass Mike Evans on that target totem pole and become the true number 1 receiver of the Buccaneers. I still think that's in his range of outcomes. But in the meantime, he's the best complimentary receiver in the league. To go with Deshaun Jackson? I mean, there's a reason why Ryan Fitzpatrick was so productive in those early weeks. He's just supported by some of the best weaponry that we have. And no O.J. Howard? Okay. One of the best backup tight ends is on that roster in Cameron Brate. So it's just talented player after talented player. Their top, it's hard to find a better trio of receivers in the league. I think you could look at the Detroit Lions. I mean, there's a handful of the LA Rams. It's a couple teams you could say, okay, this trio of receivers is better. But now you put Jameis Winston at the helm with Chris Godwin getting heavy snaps finally for that team, because last year he was dealing with Adam Humphries, and oftentimes Deshaun Jackson was not in the lineup, and still he was posting huge volume-based numbers, right? The total pass attempt distance last year for Jameis Winston, it's also known as air yards, 4,826. That was top 5 in the NFL. So his deep ball completion percentage wasn't great. Okay, he's not the deep ball completion artist that we thought he was going to be coming out of Florida State. There was thought that, he's going to be the next, downfield gunslinger. He has that rare quality that he can be accurate into the deeper quadrants of the football field. We haven't seen it yet. Last year's deep ball completion percentage was 26.6. That's 32nd in the NFL. But that'll revert back to a mean. It helps when you have a healthy Deshaun Jackson, a healthy Mike Evans, and a healthy Chris Godwin. Those players will help revert all that to a mean. So we know that he's going to be throwing a lot of passes. The run game is the worst run game in the league, and now this week he has the second best possible matchup, because I think the best possible matchup for Jameis Winston would be if he were playing the Buccaneers. But it's impossible. See how it's impossible? See, he can't. He's on the Buccaneers. So he can't play but if he could, that would be the only way it could be better for him.
Well, and a perfect example of that is the last time we saw the Bucs out, they were playing Mitch Trubisky and the Bears, and Jameis had a front row seat for Trubisky throwing those 6 touchdowns in that game. I would hope that Jameis maybe took some notes in that one. Let's talk about Trubisky a little bit here, because the Bears were also on a bye last week, and that might have the opposite effect of the Bucs. The Bucs limped into that bye, got a week to regroup. The Bears had some momentum, and then they had to cool off for a week. But that Chicago offense, they have some pieces. We saw what they could potentially be. They get the Dolphins this week, and the Dolphins have been sneaky good against the pass. They've limited opposing QBs to the second most fantasy points league-wide. They have at least one pick in every game, too. They're a little scary in that way. And they've only allowed one quarterback to throw for multiple touchdowns this year. So, Matt, given all that, are you willing to let it ride with Trubisky after that big breakout performance in Week 4?
That was quite the stretch, you touting the Dolphins defense. Are you a Dolphins beat reporter?
I am not. I'm a Bills fan.
Beat reporters are famously optimistic. But then, see, the thing is, Justin, I have the NFL schedule in front of me. And so when you look at the Dolphins season thus far in context, you can see just how fraudulent this team is, in particular, their defense. So they start off the season in a monsoon against Tennessee, where they face Marcus Mariota for only half the game before it's the Blaine Gabbert show after Mariota hurt a nerve in his elbow. So there was a weird nerve injury in Mariota's elbow halfway through that game that was in a monsoon where there was a 2-hour rain delay because of lightning. Then they face the youngest starting quarterback in the history of the NFL in Sam Darnold. Then they face an Oakland Raiders team that's using a playbook out of the late 90s. So the first 3 games of the season, I don't even count those games. It doesn't even count to me. Then they face New England, and what happens? Blowout. Tom Brady doesn't have to throw the ball in the second half. Then they face Cincinnati. What happens in Cincinnati? Oh, that's right. They have a 10-point lead in the fourth quarter, and they end up losing by 10. Like, I don't even know if that's possible. Like, that's like a riddle. Like, how you would do that. It wasn't even a 10. I think it was a 14-point lead. It was crazy. Like, it's like hard to believe how bad that team is. And then you think, oh, well, the secondary, Xavier Rhodes. Yeah, it's funny. Guys, cornerbacks with a first name that starts with X are the most overrated around the league. You look at Xavier Rhodes, you look at Xavier Howard, then you go to playerprofiler.com and you look up their advanced efficiency metrics, and a lot of them are outside the top 25, some of them outside the top 30, top 50 even. So Xavier Rhodes, Xavier Howard, neither of those cornerbacks are top 25 on the player profile or cornerback rankings. So when you actually fit the talent pieces together on this defense, you realize, oh wow, they're the sum of the parts does not equal their defensive rating statistically thus far this season. So I think that Mitchell Trubisky is going to be a sneaky play, particularly in daily fantasy, where the public is going to see, I don't want to play Mitchell Trubisky, even though he's one of the least expensive quarterbacks in DFS this week, because, the Dolphins have a good pass defense. And then you zoom out, you look at it in context, you think, actually, this is the perfect smash spot for Trubisky because it's on the road. I like that it's on the road. For that reason, I'm not playing Jordan Howard. I don't play one-dimensional grinder running backs on the road. And so if you're not going to play Jordan Howard, by extension, you got to play Mitchell Trubisky.
Well, I mean, when it comes to Trubisky, I have him as a mid-level QB2 this week. And I think he's the kind of guy that if you grab him
that's
now...
That's where he belongs. He shouldn't be outside the top 20. That's my point.
Yeah, and if you
can't push him outside the top 20 because the Dolphins are a tough defense. It's a fraudulent defense.
And you hang on to him to see what he could potentially become here. We saw Jared Goff last year when McVay showed up, and he started to develop, with McVay there. And hopefully maybe we're seeing the same thing with Trubisky. I know we've talked on the pod previously about that learning curve for Trubisky with Nagy in that offense. Maybe we saw that over the first few games, and he's starting to put it together here. We know they have the weapons there. The weapons aren't necessarily as good as the Rams' weapons, but he does have weapons. They went out and made sure they surrounded him with a little bit of talent. Woods, what are your thoughts?
I mean, this feels like a pretty crucial game for Trubisky going forward. Like, can we trust him as a fantasy starter or can we not? I mean, we saw the 6 touchdown thing. We also saw before that he looked pretty lost some of the time. Coming out of a bye, you would expect his very best performance, and if he brings it this week, then I think you maybe have a QB1 going forward. And if he falls flat, then I'm not sure there's much interest there for the rest of the season.
Look at the attempts, though. We talked about this with Jameis Winston. You chase the volume, right?
Absolutely.
The volume matters more than the efficiency. With Mitchell Trubisky, it was 36 attempts in week 1, 34 in week 2, 35 in week 3, and then in his best game of the season, only 26 attempts because they all went for touchdowns.
Well, another guy that's thrown a ton of touchdowns, and I mentioned him briefly a second ago, is Jared Goff. I mean, he was on fire there in weeks 3, weeks 4, had 8 total touchdowns, ran into a little bit of trouble last week, but I mean, it was tough to project, Brandon Cooks and Cooper Kupp suffering concussions, leaving that game. At the time that we're recording this right now, we aren't totally sure about the availability of either player. You'd have to think, Cooks has a pretty bad history of concussions. We know he had one dating back to the Super Bowl. He's had a few here. So you have to think there's a chance that both these guys might sit out. Matt, if they're sidelined for this one, they're on the road in Denver, how do you think it's going to impact that offense? Does McVay still find a way? Does McVay still get it done here? And who do you think might step up if they are out?
Brandon Cooks can't play in this game. I mean, he might play. McVay says they're doing fine and they're feeling a lot better than the coaches expected as of Monday morning, right? They came into the facility and they're like, "Hey, how you feeling?" "Oh, it looks like they're fine. They're not having to wear the sunglasses indoors, that kind of thing." I don't care. I don't care how Brandon Cooks is feeling. If he has a history of concussions, and we all saw it in the Super Bowl. I mean, by the way, that play in the Super Bowl, just go to the pylon! Run to the pylon! What are you doing, Brandon? You cost the Patriots the game! Sorry. God damn it. What was that? Anyway. Awful. I mean, didn't deserve to be concussed, though. Bonehead play, did not deserve to be concussed. If you have a history of concussions, and if you saw that hit on Sunday, that was a pretty brutal hit, pretty jarring collision.
Absolutely.
That needs to be an automatic game or two missed. There should be no discussion from Sean McVay in a press conference about availability. It just shouldn't even be a question, right? But who knows? We'll see what happens. It's hard to pinpoint what happened to Cooper Kupp. I don't think there was a particular hit that anyone saw. Either way, I think they're both questionable. Brandon Cooks probably doubtful if anyone's being rational and responsible in that organization. That means probably one guy, right? Probability says one of those guys is going to miss. Probably Brandon Cooks, right? If we had to guess, you'd guess probably what? Cooks misses and Kupp plays. Is that your guess? That's my guess.
I would agree, yeah.
Well, that means a number 3 receiver is going to step up, and as long as it's not a blowout in the second half, there's going to be a lot of 3 receiver sets called, even though it's surprising. We have the 2, 3, 4 receiver set ratios on playerprofiler.com's depth charts, and I was surprised to see the Rams don't play as many 3 receiver sets as you might think. It's just that when they pass the ball, they run a lot of 3 receiver sets, but they also run a bunch of 12 personnel, and they try to get Gurley going that way. So when they do go 3 receiver sets, it's going to be Josh Reynolds. And in a vacuum, Josh Reynolds looks like a more impressive wide receiver prospect coming out than even Cooper Kupp, because Josh Reynolds, 39.7% dominator rating at Texas A&M. That's 80th percentile. Now, that's while sharing a field with Christian Kirk. So it's very important to always keep in mind the Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham corollary. When you're sharing a field with another professional receiver in college, your dominator rating, your rate, your share of yards and touchdowns is going to be less. But even so, Josh Reynolds was dominant, and dominant at an early age. So he has the age-adjusted college dominance and the size-adjusted athleticism. You look at his catch radius, 10.22, 86th percentile. He just needs an opportunity, and he's been buried on the depth chart. Cooper Kupp, for whatever reason, was elevated, draft capital, rapport with Goff, but now they need Josh Reynolds. So he's one of the best number 4 receivers in the league. When you look across the depth charts around the league, the Rams are lucky to have a talent like Josh Reynolds waiting to be elevated, and he's the kind of guy that can go out and put up 7 catches for over 100 yards and a touchdown in a free square wide receiver spot in DFS if either of those receivers miss time.
And the touchdown aspect, the red zone ability for Reynolds, that's key to me. That's in an offense that is going to get scoring chances. I want to bank on the guy who's shown in college and the pros that he can score touchdowns. So
he's their only tall receiver.
Yeah, I think there's a chance that we could see him go out and definitely find the end zone this week. And when it comes to the concussions and trying to gauge, I stopped trying that a long time ago because I remember there was a game a couple years ago where Devontae Adams went out on Sunday with a concussion, and I don't even think I had my rankings because I was like, there's no possible way that they could put him out on the field on Thursday because they were playing a Thursday night game, and sure enough, he played on Thursday and had a great game. So, I mean, who knows? Anything's
We're not
possible.
doctors, man.
Anything is possible here. I mean,
you got to rank these guys until they're out.
I tend to go the other way with it often. I mean, I try to make a judgment call, but I tend to go the other way where if it seems like a guy is going to be out, I'll leave him out until I get a positive sign that I want to put him back in there. Although I do have Dalvin Cook in my rankings this week, so I guess we'll see on that one.
Our methodology is you got to prove it, right? You got to prove that you're like Dalvin Cook. We're not going to rank. He's got to prove it. Fool me once on Dalvin Cook, but we're going to keep these Rams receivers ranked until we get some signals from the team that one of them or both of them might miss. Just don't want to get people's hopes up with a Josh Reynolds. That's what we're trying not to do.
No, that makes sense. While we're talking about receiver injuries, let's stay on another receiver that's been dealing with injuries a little bit here. He played through it last week. It's Will Fuller, and I'm wondering if Fuller is completely healthy here because he suffered a hamstring injury a couple weeks ago. He was somehow able to play in that Sunday night game, that Texas showdown with the Cowboys. Wasn't himself, though, at all. 2 catches, 15 yards. We've seen hamstring injuries sap the productiveness of players like him, especially speed players. We also, though, saw Keke Coutee come on. He debuted 2 weeks ago, got some more opportunities because Fuller ended up not playing in the second half of that one. He's had a pretty big role, and he was dealing with injury himself last week, but he's playing on 94% of their snaps the last 2 weeks, 17 catches, 170 yards, and a score. Matt, do you think that Fuller dip in production is because of the injury, or maybe should we be worried that Keke Coutee's coming on and is going to take away some of the targets that Fuller's seeing?
It's very scary. It's very scary for Will Fuller. I would not trust him this week. You know when Will Fuller's right? You know when Will Fuller's right because he goes for over 100 yards and a touchdown. Whenever he's right with Deshaun Watson, right, he's always putting up huge fantasy points. He's a top 10 receiver when he's healthy and Deshaun Watson's healthy. Like we have that Venn diagram. But when he's not, he's not. And he's 2 for 14. A couple games ago, you see, he didn't play most of the snaps, only ran 14 routes. And then last week, played most of the snaps, ran most of the routes. So it could be just one of those things where he's finally fully online and back 100% this week. But again, it's one of those things where it's okay. You can make a guy prove it 1 week, and then you can go ahead and slide him into your lineup the following week. But there's no reason to get burned. We saw last week with Marvin Jones, even though he had that touchdown that saved a lot of people, still 10 fantasy points total, right? 1 catch. It could have been 1 catch for 8 yards and no touchdowns. And you would have really felt like a dummy for playing him knowing that he picked up that injury on Friday and that he would not be 100%. It's hard enough to play football at 100%, right? But Larry Fitzgerald and Marvin Jones and now Will Fuller are showing you what happens when you play at less than 100%, especially when there's another player on the team that can run that route tree. It can do the things that you do. So I don't know if it's Coutee or Coutee. I know you said Coutee. I say Coutee. I don't know.
I feel like I've heard both.
It might be Cutie. We've heard that too. Yeah, we should really look this up.
That
yeah.
sounds. That's cute. That's a cute name, Cutie. Oh, you're like a little cutie. Oh, that's really like it makes me smile to say, oh, cutie. I have it my face automatically smiles when I hear that. But he runs a 4.43, which is very Will Fullerian, right? That's not a word. And also the great agility. So he can play the slot with the agility. He can just extend the field, stretch it out on the outside. And look at the matchup really favors Coutee and Fuller. I really want Fuller to play well because he'll be going against Lafayette Pitts, who was a general in the French and Indian War, I believe. I don't know if that was maybe you guys can help me out. I don't know if that was the Battle of Ottawa or what it was. But I remember Lafayette Pitts was a big deal back in the day. But as a cornerback, probably the Battle of Buffalo. That would make sense, right? On the Ontario, Erie section, whatever. So that guy's not good as a cornerback, and neither is their third cornerback in Buffalo, Ryan Lewis. Both of them are well outside the top 50 on the player profile or cornerback rankings. And then Tre'Davious White on the other end of the spectrum, he's one of the best cornerbacks in the league. He's one of the handful of those rookie cornerbacks from last year that have fully ascended. Marlon Humphrey in Baltimore is another one. I know that Marshawn Lattimore is not playing as well this year, but certainly Marshawn Lattimore last year was breaking out. I think right now, in terms of 2017 to 2018, the most consistent rookie cornerback in that class has been Tre'Davious White. He's now a full-blown shutdown corner. No one can shut down DeAndre Hopkins. He's going to get the targets regardless. But can he sort of suppress some of the targets? Sure. Can he affect the efficiency? Yeah, he can. And that should divert some targets toward Coutee and Fuller. But we know that Coutee is healthy and Will Fuller's not. Similar skill set. I'll take the cute one.
All right, first things first, I just looked it up, and it is Keke Coutee. That's how he wants us to pronounce it, apparently.
Cutie.
All right,
cute.
So there you go. Yeah, I would say...
Like a Q-tip? Like QT?
I think so, yeah.
Like Q-tip, but QT. Okay,
Sure.
Hey, QT.
Now we know.
I would say there's...
So we were all wrong.
Yeah, well, yeah, we were. I mean, I think I'm with Matt in that just that hamstring injury for a player who's so dependent on speed like Fuller, I think you have to worry about that. I think there's a second injury you have to worry about here too, which is that Deshaun Watson has a chest injury. That sounds like he's going to play and they think he's okay, but maybe the play calls you don't want to make when your quarterback has a chest injury are play calls that require him to stand in the pocket and wait for his receiver to get deep and then uncork a deep throw and take a big hit in the chest. So I would probably try to stay away from Fuller this week. I'm not that worried about the volume issue with Coutee there. Fuller's not a player who's dependent on high volume. He scores those fantasy points in explosive plays. But, it's tempting to want to play him this week because, as Matt said, the matchup's so interesting, but there's just a few reasons to be a little wary.
Well, let's go from a receiving core that's been extremely kind to fantasy owners, that even though Fuller hasn't been as good the last couple of weeks, obviously the Texans receivers have been pretty good for fantasy, to one that's been much more difficult to decipher, and it's the Seahawks receiving core. I mean, their offense as a whole seems to be a little difficult to decipher from week to week with the backfield as well, but Doug Baldwin's back, but he's playing through that knee injury and definitely hasn't been as effective. Tyler Lockett's actually been their best receiver this year. Brandon Marshall seems to have been overtaken by David Moore. Nick Vanette's the last man standing in that tight end core. Matt, they have a pretty nice matchup with the Raiders this week, and we can mention they're going to be in London for that one. But is there any Seahawks receiver that you feel confident in and that you would trust in your fantasy lineup at the moment?
I mean, Tyler Lockett's been good, has he not? I mean, his average target distance is 13.0, so he's getting down the field, and then he's been incredibly efficient. His quarterback rating when targeted is 152.8. That's number one in the NFL. And his dominator rating is 36%, which is number two in the NFL. Because this offense is so anemic, when you look at these rate stats, these efficiency stats, shares of offense, shares of air yards, well, Tyler Lockett bubbles up to the top because he's been productive. on an offense that's not productive at all. So in general, I'm staying away from this offense. I don't want anything to do with the running game. I'm off Russell Wilson. I'm off everybody except Tyler Lockett, because we've seen, even on the worst offenses, right, the one player you can sometimes trust is the number one receiver, especially if the other options are David Moore and a hobbled Doug Baldwin. And that's what we have in Seattle. So I think that we're seeing a real consolidation of targets and the leveraging of weapons to a couple guys in that offense, and the number one most utilized offensive weapon other than Russell Wilson himself has been Tyler Lockett. So ride with Tyler Lockett. I think in DFS, for example, he's slowly becoming not just a GPP play, but also a cash play.
The only thing that's a little scary for me when it comes to that receiving core is just how low the amount of pass attempts has been. And I worry with a guy like Lockett. I know he's been good so far, but I do worry if Baldwin starts to take on a little more. We saw Baldwin barely do anything last week. If Baldwin does see some more targets here, if it can continue for Lockett, I have lowered him a little bit in my rankings. I'm not as confident in him this week, but it is a nice matchup. One guy that I'm...
Yeah, the target share is there. The overall target number, 28, that's outside the top 45.
It's great if it continues.
That's the red flag on it. If there's one red flag, it's total targets, not where you want to be with Tyler Lockett.
Now, what about on the other side of the field in that one? I mentioned it's the Raiders. Amari Cooper has just been rotating between monster game and incredibly disappointing weeks.
Get out of here, man.
Week 1, 1 catch, 9 yards. Week 2, 10 catches, 116 yards. Week 3, 2 catches for 17 yards. Week 4, 8 catches, 128 and a touchdown. Week 5, 1 catch, 10 yards. A pretty good fantasy ceiling and a horrific fantasy floor there. Matt, based on what I heard you just say there, I'm guessing you are all out on Cooper.
He's a fraud, man. He's a fraud. And stop measuring cornerbacks based on this Amari Cooper litmus test. That's how Xavier Howard became overrated. Oh, he shut down Amari Cooper, as if that's an accomplishment. Get out of here. Get out of here. I mean, it's one thing to have a bad season, right? And it wasn't just a bad season. You got to put that 2017 season in context. It was so horrific because his statistics all came in one game against Kansas City. Think about that. If he didn't have the best game for a wide receiver yardage-wise of anyone in the NFL last season against Kansas City, then what are we talking about? Then it's one of the most epic bust seasons of all time for a wide receiver, and it's okay. Maybe he was hurt. Maybe there were other factors. Who knows? He's a human being. You can't carry it over and disappoint in 3 out of 5 weeks the following year. You do it the following year, I'm out. I'm out. I'm done.
How about let's talk about
I've already traded him all leagues. Bye.
Let's talk about the running back version of Amari Cooper here.
League mates. Your problem now.
The running back version of Amari Cooper seems to be Isaiah Crowell, and
What do you think?
I will read you the exact.
Do you agree
same,
with this?
With what?
I feel like I'm a minority here. I feel like I just need to wait, and that his talent will eventually show through. He had so many, quality seasons at Alabama that he strung together, and then he had back-to-back, productive and efficient seasons with the Raiders, and then I'm just not being patient enough, right? I'm being too much of a prisoner of the moment. That's the accusation. What do you think about Amari Cooper?
If I had Cooper right now, I think the frustration would lead me to move him. I will say that I did trade for him recently in one league, but it's because of what I gave up. I gave up Derrick Henry, who I was ready to drop anyway.
Well,
and I gave up
Amari
Lamar
Cooper
Miller,
running backs.
Lamar Miller, who might lose his job in the coming weeks if he hasn't already, and is dealing with an injury himself. So I didn't give up very much to just roll the dice on Cooper there.
Amari Cooper, I would say, sneaky NFL trade deadline candidate. I'm not sure the Raiders, they're probably feeling the same way that Matt is and many fantasy owners. It's just the inconsistency is too annoying. What is this guy? Are we ever going to find out? I think Cooper probably needs and wants a fresh start at this point, and the Raiders are going to have to decide really soon if they're going to commit big money to him, because that's what it's going to cost just based on the idea that he's a number one receiver. So with that trade deadline approaching, I think there's a chance he's on the move somewhere else.
That would be cool. Is there a precedent for Amari Cooper? Let's say hypothetically that he puts together a highly disappointing season, let's say 4 good games out of 16, right, at this rate, and then you add the 2017 season, have we ever in the NFL seen a rookie that is so highly touted, top 10 pick rookie, be productive for the first 2 seasons on a can't-miss trajectory, then tank in year 3 and year 4? Is there a precedent for that? Have you ever seen that?
I said before the season, like if it continued the way it was last year, I thought we were going to find out something behind the scenes, either some terrible injury or some off-field issues or something. Because I don't think we have. I don't think we've seen that happen.
I've racked my brain. I've gone down the history of receivers that are bust receivers and receivers that experience some sort of resurgence in their career, but nothing like what we're seeing with Amari Cooper. The highs were just so high and the lows so low. I've just never seen a receiver that's displayed this level of volatility through 4 years. And now I'm just sort of excited to watch it as a bystander. Thank God I don't have him in any leagues anymore. I can just sit back as a bystander and see how it plays out. Thank God I'm a spectator on this guy.
The weird thing there is that it's just hard to sort of explain away. You would think, oh, well, maybe he has an injury and that's why, but he doesn't really seem to have been hurt over these years. I think, oh, maybe it's the scheme, it's the coaching stuff. Well, he has a new coach this year and the same things are still happening, so it does all seem to come back to Amari Cooper.
And
weird.
Yeah, Gruden even seems to be making some, veiled comments at him. If not, maybe they aren't even veiled. He's kind of making comments to the media about that, we're trying to get him the ball and things like that. And it's worked some weeks, but definitely didn't work last week. Matt, based on how passionate you are about your Cooper take.
The only example I can think of is Tiger Woods.
Something completely off field.
He was the Tiger Woods of NFL receivers. And then he just, for whatever reason, injuries and lack of passion and fire, you just decided, you know what? I just don't feel like picking up a golf club right now. I'm sorry. I'm just not into it. I'm burned out. Like, maybe he was such a football head for so long and now he's burned out. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't want to come to the office anymore. And he's just, and Gruden's sensing it. Who knows? Who knows?
Let's talk about who I think is the running back version of Amari Cooper, and that's Isaiah Crowell. And I will do the same here. I will read his stat lines. Week 1, 10 carries, 102 yards, 2 touchdowns. Week 2, 12 carries, 35 yards. Week 3, 16 carries, only 34 yards, but had 2 touchdowns again. Week 4, 4 carries, 0 yards. And then last week we saw 15 carries, 219 yards, and a touchdown. There was some minimal receiving work in there, but not enough that I thought it warranted mentioning. On tap this week, he's got the Colts. They've been pretty average against the run this year. So, Matt, you were very passionate about Cooper. What is your take on Crowell?
Choo-choo. This is very easy to understand. And I disagree with you because you have one that's just a total enigma. Like, Amari Cooper is the most enigmatic wide receiver in the history of the NFL. Isaiah Crowell is the most predictable. We know what's going to happen. In those games where he didn't produce fantasy points, that's because the Jets went down 20-0 at halftime, and they had to throw the entire second half, and that's not an Isaiah Crowell game. The other game was against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So that's not an Isaiah Crowell. No one's playing Isaiah Crowell against Jacksonville for a lot of reasons. Game script, volume, everything. It's just all going to work. The stoutness of the Jacksonville defensive line and linebacking core. It doesn't, for all the reasons, just stack up against Isaiah Crowell. In those other games that looked like better matchups, even one that wasn't a good matchup on paper against the Denver Broncos, there he goes, doing Isaiah Crowell things, rolling up yards and scoring touchdowns. And the key is, it's when he's at home. When they're at home, even against Denver, because Denver's defense isn't as good as people think because they get credit for those low-volume games that happen in Denver. That is part of the overall all the defensive efficiency metrics. They don't take into account the general lack of volume, the slower pace that you see in Denver in those games. So there's just less points scored, less yardage accrued in Denver than in other stadiums. So the Denver Broncos defense is typically overrated for that reason. And then specifically when they go on the road, they're vulnerable. So that's when you saw Isaiah Crowell strike. Now he's at home against what is not merely a bad defense on paper, it's just simply a bad defense. And if there's one area where you can attack the Colts, it's on the ground. So you can see game script working in their favor, which is not common. If you're a Jet fan, you know that. But this is a game where you can see game script working in his favor. So this is a great example where I'm much more likely to play a Crowell because he's a grinder at home than I would be Jordan Howard going on the road. These are similar players. Jordan Howard has the better team, but because it's a road game, I prefer Crowell.
Let's stick with backfields here, and I mentioned before that we were going to talk about them. Jacksonville.
I mean, do you agree with that?
Ton of injuries.
Justin, what do you think?
I
don't know. Am I on track with this one?
I like.
Am I talking crazy, or do you think Crowell's just had a lucky streak of games?
I'm not willing to rank Crowell ahead of Howard. I like your take about the road thing, but I have a lot of faith in Howard and his upcoming schedule. I think he's going to have a chance to turn this around, and I think people are a little too worried about that performance that he had in that blowout. I think that was the approach. That's what Nagy wanted to do. They wanted to attack the Bucs through the air. We know that you should attack the Bucs through the air, and they were smart to involve Tariq Cohen in that one. I think moving forward, in the upcoming schedule, next 5 games, I think this game that they're going to have this week against the Dolphins, that's a game where you're going to be able to run on them. They play the Bills coming up. They play the Lions twice in the next 7 weeks. I think he's going to have a pretty good schedule. I think Howard is going to be a guy whose stock is going to rise quite a bit here. I like Crowell. I like what you said, but Crowell is going to go up and down. Crowell is going to be very difficult.
Playing him against the Patriots, for example, but I'm much more comfortable playing that guy at home against a weak run defense, regardless of what the projected game script is going to be. We're not Nostradamus. We don't know what the game is, how it's going to play out. So for that reason, I lean more on the home road splits with the running backs.
I do have Crowell higher than most weeks this week. I think he is going to have a pretty good week.
Smash spot.
I think he is going to have a pretty good week. What do you think about TJ Yeldon, though? I talked about him earlier, said I bumped him down a couple spots just with the matchup and with Jamaal Charles showing up. The injuries that they have there, I mean, Leonard Fournette, I think he's going to miss a few more weeks. I think they're going to play it really, really slow with him now after what happened after having him come back and re-aggravate that injury. I think he's going to be out for a few games. We know Corey Grant out for the year now. Jamaal Charles is going to turn 32 in December. Personally, I think he's done. I didn't see much from him the last couple years that I thought that he was going to be able to come onto a roster and really make a big fantasy impact. How do you think this is going to play out with Charles? Do you think he's just going to be a bit player and play in the background, or do you think he's going to start to pick up some significant carries there?
No, you got to be excited about TJ Yeldon here, right? I mean, TJ Yeldon produced last week in a spot where running backs don't typically produce, especially the between the tackles grinders. We talked about this. Not only were they going on the road, they were going on the road against a team that was a prolific offense where they would be facing negative game script in the second half. And yet what happened? TJ Yeldon still delivered. He delivered because he is Melvin Gordon East. He will give you fantasy points somehow, some way. He has those outs on the river. That's why you want all-purpose backs, not between the tackles grinders. When you go on the road, they can help you in the passing game when they're not getting those goal line touchdowns. TJ Yeldon is a phenomenal play this week.
Let me just weigh in on Jamaal Charles since we did talk about him. I mean, I think I'm with you. When you watch his tape last year, and he looks like a player who's basically at the end. I mean, it's not a mistake that he wasn't signed until this week, and the Jaguars went and got him because they were absolutely desperate at the position. I think it's just as likely that Jamaal Charles is off the roster next week and they're shuffling in some new third down back to fill that role.
I mean, this is not right. This is basically like, remember the talk of Brandon Marshall this summer? Remember that? Brandon Marshall had a game where he commanded a significant target share and then it was over. I think that's what we're looking at with Jamaal Charles.
I like that. I like that take and that comparison. All right, so for week 6, one thing we do at the end of every preview podcast is we look at who is a player, or maybe some players, if you want to talk about a few, who you think are being overlooked heading into week 6.
Oh, just an open-ended question like that?
Just an open-ended question.
Well, we talked about this with Mitchell Trubisky. It's easy to forget that Anthony Miller was one of the best wide receiver prospects in this draft, and he hasn't produced this year. Well, that's also because Mitchell Trubisky didn't really produce much except throw the ball a lot, and it didn't go very far in the first few weeks when Anthony Miller was actually healthy. But Anthony Miller comes back from injury. He wasn't on the field for that one prolific game, so he's protected from getting his value inflated from some, 5-6 touchdown game. Everyone's, Taylor Gabriel. Oh, look at Taylor Gabriel. He's like, Tyreek Hill Jr., right? No, I don't know. I'm not sure. I still wouldn't be surprised if Anthony Miller finishes the year as number 2 on the Bears in targets. That's still in his range of outcomes. He can still become a guy that commands 10 targets a game. Just because he was hurt and he missed out on the one big game that Mitchell Trubisky had doesn't mean it's over. He's available on a lot of waiver wires. You can get him thrown in on deals, and now is the time to strike. I would say that about Traquan Smith, but that's the problem with Traquan Smith is he just erupted. And I did look at the snap shares for Cameron Meredith versus Traquan Smith, and Traquan Smith almost doubled the snaps last Monday night for Cameron Meredith. So I know that they both had good games, and they both sort of emerged as featured weapons in that offense. That's very exciting. But I think that Traquan Smith is a guy that's has earned a significant role in that offense moving forward. Anthony Miller earned it in preseason. We were talking, wasn't he the most talked about rookie wide receiver? Right? And then now no one mentions his name. Well, that's a guy that I'm not forgetting about, and I'm continuing to stash away on my bench in seasonal leagues.
Amen. I was a big Anthony Miller fan in the preseason, and I like, and that's my point too with Jordan Howard. If Trubisky gets better, it's just going to help all members of that offense. And my only worry is they might try to spread the ball around a little bit, so maybe Miller won't ever command that kind of massive target share that would really rise him up the fantasy ranks. But I think he is an excellent talent, and I like that call as long as he plays.
It was perfectly timed bye week, by the way, for fantasy footballers that are savvy. So it gives us time to do whatever we want for a week, and that game, that incredible breakout game for Mitchell Trubisky, just gets pushed further back in the recesses of everyone's mind, and that it provides you with a trade window to go out and get not only Anthony Miller, but also Trey Burton, also Jordan Howard, also Tariq Cohen, all of the Allen Robinson. All of these pieces of this Bears offense, I think, are still undervalued. I think that was a bellwether game that we saw in week 4, and I think that we had this perfectly timed bye week. So now this week you can capitalize on it and go trade for all of those pieces, because we compared Mitchell Trubisky to Jameis Winston earlier. Well, the supporting cast in Chicago isn't that far off from what they have in Tampa. You think about who's playing X. It's Allen Robinson and Mike Evans. You think, who's the field stretcher? Oh, it's Taylor Gabriel. It's Deshaun Jackson. You think, who's that upcomer number 3 option? Oh, it's Anthony Miller. It's Chris Godwin. Who's the tight end? See what I'm saying? You go down the list. If anything, Mitchell Trubisky has better options in the passing game out of the backfield.
Woods, for overlooked, who you got?
I'm just going to make the case that everybody should start Cameron Brate this week. I mean, we've sort of covered some of this already. We talked about why Jameis Winston's a QB1 this week against that Falcons defense. It makes sense that he should throw to his tight end because, we've seen previously he has chemistry with Brate. The Buccaneers have, as we said, those 3 good wide receivers, but they have targets to go around, and they don't send many of them to their running backs. It's just not a backfield that catches passes. If you look at the targets this season, it's got to go somewhere. O.J. Howard is hurt. Brate back in the lineup. I think he can immediately go in and start for you.
I think another guy with the Bucs too. I'm going to say I got one with the Bucs that I think goes along with Woods here, and it's Chris Godwin. We talked about him before. I think
nice.
I think people are overlooking him though, right? Like people, especially he had that bad game in the blowout, but before that,
forget about Chris Godwin.
A touchdown in 3 straight games to start the year. Then he has a bad game. Then you go into the bye. Totally overlooked guy, and once again, that matchup just fantastic.
Chase your shootouts, man. It's not just that the Buccaneers have a bad pass defense, and that helps those Falcons receivers. It's not just that the Falcons have a bad defense, and that helps the Buccaneers. This is a symbiotic relationship. It creates this flywheel where one bad defense aids the other offense, and the other bad defense helps the other offense. So now we're in a back-and-forth shootout. I love that. That's so many matchups in fantasy football have been won by fantasy gamers playing players in those shootouts, those often with the lesser brand equity. So a lot of times you're better off playing the player with lesser brand equity if he's going to be operating as a key component of a shootout than someone with more brand equity who's going to be slogging it out in one of those 9-6 games. And the quintessential example of that this week is Mohamed Sanu.
Absolutely.
He's the true number 2 receiver in that offense. It's not Calvin Ridley. Mohamed Sanu's playing more snaps, running more routes. Last week, got the touchdown, was more productive, and he's facing the worst pass defense in the NFL this week. He has the best matchup of any wide receiver in fantasy football, but he doesn't have the brand equity, so he's often forgotten.
So those are some of the players that we like for this week. We got to go to the opposite side now. Matt, we'll start with you. Once again, could just be one player that you're totally out on. Could be a few. We'll try to quickly go through these. Who are you already willing to give up on at this point in the year through 5 games?
Well, one of the cheat codes for finding players to fade is to go to the game scores, right? Go to the game total over-unders in Las Vegas and find the game with the lowest total. What is it? It's Dallas-Jacksonville, right? Only 40 points implied. And I know that there aren't that many weapons, right, that are going to be operating in that game anyway, but we saw that last week with Ezekiel Elliott underperform. I think that Ezekiel Elliott has the brand equity, but in that game, with that matchup, where no team is going to be incentivized to score, I think that's an aggressive over-under for Vegas. I think it should be under 40. And I think that Ezekiel Elliott is going to have a difficult time meeting his expected fantasy points this week.
I think now that's one for this week. Woods, do you have anybody that you totally are looking to give up on? Not just this week, but maybe moving forward as well?
Oh, you want to give up on a guy?
Yeah, who are...
you want me to cut the cord on somebody?
Totally give up on
Let
them
me
for
rattle
the
off
rest
some
of the
guys.
year.
Let me rattle off some guys
I
I would
of
drop.
those guys.
All right.
I thought you were going to contrarian fade.
Here's some guys I would drop. Derrick Henry, obviously. There's no reason to keep Chris Hogan anymore. I don't think there's any reason to keep Kenny Stills. That one hurts. We liked him a lot before the season. I think I'm done with him. I don't know what you're holding on to with Marlon Mack. I don't know what you're holding on to with Larry Fitzgerald at this point. I think he's pretty much done. And I don't know why you'd keep any Jaguars wide receiver because we just can't project which one is going to get the targets in that offense. That's a few to get us started. Matt, you got a few guys you're done with?
I am... Oh, man. First of all, I would sell high on Calvin Ridley. I think that's... I alluded to that earlier, but I think the best sell high candidate right now is Calvin Ridley because he has the brand equity, but he's still only running routes, half the time, half the snaps he's in there. What are you doing, right? I mean, yes, he's getting lucky with the most unsustainable touchdown rate. Now Traquan Smith has the most unsustainable touchdown rate, but before Traquan Smith came around, it was Calvin Ridley. I'm done with all members of this Washington passing game. I don't know if anyone has Jamison Crowder or ranked highly, but get out of here with Jamison Crowder. You talked about it with the Jaguars receivers. Get out of here with Dede Westbrook. I think that he was sort of a fireworks display in the sky for a couple weeks, but then we're come back to reality. He's a Jaguar, right? I am, done with Chris Hogan. Quincy Enunwa was a nice story, but now Jermaine Kearse is running Enunwa's routes. So that's not going to happen. And get out of here. Get out of here with Antonio Callaway. Antonio Callaway has been awful. And while you chase the opportunity, that rule only goes so far because a player cannot be so abysmal in the efficiency department for an entire year before it starts to affect his opportunity and the team starts to wind down his routes and therefore his targets. I am not chasing Antonio Callaway. Give me all the Jarvis Landry. He's going to lead the league in targets, and he may break the record.
And I also like Njoku, too, the rest of the way. I get to back cleanup here, but you guys mentioned so many of them already. Jamison Crowder, totally on board with that. Drop him. I mentioned last week, Woods, I thought he was a boring fantasy play. You guys gave me a bit of a hard time, but still just not doing that much. Lucky to get a touchdown, maybe in a PPR league, but even then, I just want someone with more upside.
Woods?
Sorry? Jamison Crowder.
Look, we don't need to.
Robert Woods.
No.
Yeah, I was teasing.
Keep Robert Woods.
No, I was teasing Woods over. I was teasing Woods over here.
Both the other starters might be out with concussions. Oh, this could be the smashiest week of all for Robert Woods. Oh my God.
No one is suggesting you drop my distant relative Robert Woods. No, keep him on your roster. Yeah.
Woods. I mean, he has a boring name, but he has a very exciting game.
Larry Fitzgerald, another one that got mentioned. Definitely he's faded as the year's gone along. The last couple seasons, normally he starts hot and then fades. This year picked up the injury. No thanks. And the guys that I traded in that previous Amari Cooper conversation, the Derrick Henry, I'd outright drop him. Lamar Miller, you can try to see if anybody will give you anything for him, but at this point, with Deonta Foreman coming back in week 7, with Alfred Blue doing more with his touches last week than Miller's done with his all season long, it's hard to see a situation where Miller's going to come back in and get the lion's share of the targets there. Matt, we made it. We've come to the end of the show. Great job by you. We really appreciate you coming on, man.
Thanks, buddy. I loved it.
Why don't you give the listeners a heads up of some of the things that are coming down at Roto Underworld and at Player Profiler?
Well, there's a lot going on. PlayerProfiler.com. You can look up all the advanced metrics that I mentioned today and a lot more. We are the one-stop shop for advanced stats, metrics, analytics on players, and not just the in-game stats, not just the QB rating when targeted and target separation, but also the workout metrics, burst score, agility score, catch radius, like we talked about with Josh Reynolds. So first and foremost, it's just your authoritative source to pull all the important stats on players. And then we also have player rankings and a DFS lineup genius and a whole bunch of other resources. And check out the podcast, Roto Underworld Radio, on iTunes and wherever you get podcasts.
And I will say with Player Profiler, it's all laid out so nicely. There's so much information there, but it's laid out very, very nice. So it's a great job by you guys over there. Make sure you're following Matt on Twitter, as I mentioned before, at fantasy_mansion. Woods and I are going to be back on Sunday night, a full breakdown, all the fantasy takeaways from the Week 6 action, as well as our first look at the waiver wire pickups that you are going to have to try to get next week. We're going to give you a head start on those. If you want to get in touch with Woods, or if you just want to commiserate with him over lost fantasy seasons, at David P. Woods. You can check the score.
Not to be confused with Robert Woods.
Never to be confused with Robert Woods. You can check the score app for all our fantasy content. Make sure you're coming on, checking out every single day. My rankings are on there. Start, sit. You'll be able to find the podcast there as well. And if you have any questions for me, hit me up at Justin Boone. Big thanks to Matt. Big thanks to everybody out there for listening. And we will see you next time.
Said leave on time. My baby said leave on time.